Overgrown errand boy? That's what Aunt Marla called me, right after my own father's will cut me out completely. Gerald wore Dad's cufflinks like trophies. Mike smirked while signing away the plant I ran for 20 years. And that manila envelope in front of me? Empty, just like every promise I ever kept. But the second betrayal hit harder. Turns out the cousins maxed out the company's credit, with my name as guarantor. They stole everything and left me drowning in their debt. I nearly walked away. Nearly. But then I remembered something Dad once said. Not all treasures are written in ink. So the next time I entered that room, I didn't come empty-handed. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I'm 45 years old. I manage operations at Mercer Steelworks, the shop my father Robert built from nothing but sweat and borrowed tools. Every morning at 5, I unlock the heavy doors. Just like I've done since I was 20. The familiar scent of metal shavings and industrial oil fills my lungs, while decades of honest work have etched permanent grit into my palms. It's too quiet now, 3 weeks after Dad's funeral. My uncles James and Peter, along with their sons, have been hovering around the office daily, rifling through papers and checking account balances before the will reading tomorrow. But Dad always told me, Danny, the real treasures stay where paper can't reach them. I've kept every book clean, every tool sharp, and every promise I made to him. But let me start from the beginning. I arrived at Morrison & Partners 40 minutes early, my leather portfolio tucked under my arm. The receptionist barely glanced up as I gave my name. "Third floor, conference room B," she said, like she'd been rehearsing that line all morning. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and can tell something's off? The conference room was staged like a museum piece. Polished oak table gleaming under recessed lights, leather chairs arranged with military precision, and manila envelopes fanned out like playing cards ready for some high-stakes game. The air vent hummed overhead, pushing around that artificial coolness law offices always seem to have. I chose my seat carefully, 3 spaces down from the head of the table where Morrison would sit, close enough to read documents without squinting, far enough to keep an eye on everyone. The leather creaked under me as I pulled out my notepad and pen. I'd spent half the night writing down questions about outstanding receivables, inventory valuations, and any liens against the property. Dad always said preparation beats prayer. Remember those school plays where you could tell the ending just by how the kids were positioned on stage? That's what it felt like when my cousins Mike and Thomas shuffled in, all subdued snickers and sideways glances. They took seats directly across from me, spreading out papers like they were settling in for a long poker game. "Morning, Danny," Mike said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Hope you didn't lose sleep over this." Thomas actually had the nerve to smirk. My Uncle Gerald was next, wearing Dad's favorite gold cufflinks, the ones I'd polished every Christmas before wrapping them up again, just so Dad could pretend to be surprised. My throat tightened at the sight of them catching the fluorescent light. "Those are looking sharp, Gerald," I said, keeping my voice steady. Dad always did take good care of his things. Gerald tugged at his sleeve. "Robert had excellent taste. Shame he never got around to teaching you about the finer points of business." I let that one slide, focusing instead on Morrison as he walked in. His tie knotted tight as a hangman's rope. He carried a leather-bound folder that looked older than me, probably stuffed with all those documents I'd helped Dad sign over the years. I'd been the one explaining half the technical terms to the old man, but try telling that to the vultures across the table. "Good morning, everyone," Morrison said. His voice clipped like he was reading from a script. "I trust we're all here for the reading of Robert Mercer's last will and testament." He paused, doing that lawyer thing where they pretend to count heads they've already counted. "Very good. Let's begin with confirming the document's validity." I watched him lay out the paperwork, noting how Mike and Thomas kept trading looks like they were sharing some private joke. 20 years I'd spent maintaining those properties Morrison was about to read off. The main factory complex on Wilson Street, the warehouse over in Millbrook, even that lakeside cabin Dad used maybe twice a year. But I kept ready just in case. Every property had my sweat soaked into its foundation. "If everyone's ready," Morrison said, adjusting his reading glasses, "I'll proceed with the dispositive paragraphs." He drew in a breath like a man about to dive underwater. I gripped my pen tighter, knuckles going white. Across the table, Mike leaned forward just enough to block my view of the first page. The air vent kicked up a notch, drowning out the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. Morrison's voice droned like a funeral dirge as he read down the list. I wrote each asset in my neat columns, the same way I'd tracked inventory for 2 decades. The main fabrication plant on Wilson, gone to Mike. The Millbrook warehouse complex, Thomas got that prize. The lakeside cabin I'd maintained every spring, straight to Gerald. With each pronouncement, my cousin's smirks grew wider, like cats who'd found the key to the birdcage. You ever watch a car crash in slow motion? That's what it felt like. Hearing Morrison's careful lawyer speak strip away 20 years of my life, piece by piece. But it was that one phrase that hit like a hammer to the chest, excluding my son Daniel from all interests and claims thereof. The pen trembled in my grip. Aunt Marla, perched next to Gerald like some overdressed vulture, didn't even try to whisper. Well, what did the overgrown errand boy expect? Her voice carried just enough to make sure I caught every word. Running around with a toolbox doesn't make you management material. I forced my shoulders back, kept my spine straight like Dad taught me. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I'd been biting the inside of my cheek without realizing it. Mr. Morrison, I said, proud that my voice stayed level. I'd like to review the inventory schedules for ongoing projects. There are several custom orders in production that all operational documents, Morrison cut in, shuffling papers like they were radioactive, will transfer to the designated beneficiaries through standard protocols. I'm afraid I can't discuss specifics without their express authorization. The manila envelope in front of me, the one I'd been sure would hold Dad's instructions for carrying on his legacy, sat empty as a broken promise. 20 years of dawn starts, of teaching apprentices the right way to true a beam, of knowing every client by name and preference. All of it disappeared into that blank envelope. Click, click, click. Each cousin signing their acceptance forms with expensive pens they'd probably bought just for this moment. The sound echoed off the conference room walls, drumming out the rhythm of my humiliation. The air felt thick enough to choke on, heavy with that artificial cooling and the sharp scent of fresh ink. Remember how it feels when you're a kid and you fall hard in front of everyone? That burning in your face? That desperate wish to disappear? Multiple that by about 1,000, and you'll get close to what was churning in my gut. I stood up slowly, gathered my useless notes into my portfolio. Thank you for your time, Mr. Morrison. Professional to the end. Dad taught me that much, at least. My legs felt wooden as I turned toward the door. The glass reflected back a stranger. A man locked out of his own life story. Hair neat, tie straight, shoulders squared against the weight of everything that had just been stolen. Behind me, I could see Mike and Thomas already huddled over property documents, dividing up the kingdom I'd helped build. Then it hit me. Right as my hand touched the door handle, Dad's voice, clear as yesterday. Not all treasures are written in ink, Danny boy. He'd said it that day we were cleaning out the workshop safe before the holiday shutdown. I'd been 17, watching him sort through papers with those careful, calloused hands. The memory froze me mid-step. 1 foot, hanging in the air like some comedy routine. But there wasn't anything funny about the ice suddenly racing down my spine, or the way my heart kicked against my ribs. The drive home felt like one of those nightmares where you're screaming, but no sound comes out. Just me, the steering wheel, and 23 minutes to catalog everything I'd lost. The fabrication plant where I'd learned to read blueprints upside down. The Millbrook complex where I'd helped install every overhead crane. Even the lake cabin where Dad taught me to fish, telling me patience was worth more than luck. You know what really got me? The office key. I'd carried it since I was 19, knew its weight in my pocket like I knew my own name. Now it was just a piece of metal I had no right to use. Funny how fast ours becomes theirs. I pulled into my driveway as the afternoon light started to fade. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I spread the company ledgers across my kitchen table. Hell of a way to spend a Tuesday night, but I needed to see the damage on paper. The numbers stared back at me, each column a record of trust I'd given without question. Co-signed credit lines, equipment leases, supplier contracts. My signature everywhere, binding me to debts that weren't mine anymore. Not all treasures are written in ink. Dad's words kept circling in my head like moths around a porch light. I'd been taking it as some kind of poetic comfort. But that wasn't Dad's style. He was steel and concrete, not metaphors. When he said something, it meant something you could touch. I closed my eyes, trying to see past the obvious. Dad in his office, Dad at job sites, Dad at the cabin. No, wait. Dad in the workshop. Always the workshop before holidays, doing his closing routine. The way he'd check the machines, sort the tools, and then the safe. That old black dial Mosler tucked behind the welding station. I'd watched him spin that combination so many times it was like a ritual. Slow turns punctuated by careful stops, his fingers finding the numbers by memory more than sight. My hands started tingling. I grabbed my keys. Not the office set, but the spare workshop key I kept for emergency maintenance. The night air hit me as I crossed the yard, gravel crunching under my boots. The shop stood dark against the sky, solid as a promise. The lock clicked open, and that smell hit me. Sawdust and metal shavings, gear oil, and decades of honest work. My fingers found the light switch by muscle memory. Fluorescence hummed to life, throwing shadows off the drill press, the lathe. The bandsaw Dad had rebuilt 3 times rather than replace. There it was, exactly where it had always been. The Mosler safe, its black face wearing 20 years of shop dust like a badge of honor. I knelt down, ran my fingers over the dial. The numbers were worn smooth in places, especially around certain digits. Dad's habit, leaving traces even time couldn't erase. The vent fan droned overhead, keeping time as I started to turn the dial. Each number felt like it might be right, might be wrong, might be the difference between answers and a permanently jammed mechanism. My palm was sweating against the cool metal. Should I risk it? A forced attempt could lock everything away forever. But then again, what was left to lose? I closed my eyes, trying to see Dad's hands moving over this same dial. The way he'd pause, the slight tilt of his head when he concentrated. There was a pattern there, written in memory rather than ink. All I had to do was read it right. The fan kept humming, steady as a metronome. While I sat there with my hand on the dial and 20 years of watched moments hanging in the balance, I drove to the law office first thing next morning, before the coffee shop next door had even opened its doors. No point letting emotion make me sloppy. Dad taught me better than that. You want to know something funny? The same receptionist who'd watched me walk out humiliated yesterday actually smiled at me. Guess bad news makes some folks comfortable. I'd like certified copies of the will and supporting documents, I told her, keeping my voice steady. Complete set, please. She typed something into her computer. That'll be $45 per copy, Mr. Mercer. I pulled out my wallet. 3 copies. Might as well do this right the first time. While she processed the paperwork, I studied the office's chrome and glass decor. Amazing how different a place looks when you're not being gutted alive in it. When she handed me the envelope, I thanked her like this was any other business transaction. Never let them see you sweat. Another of Dad's rules that served me well. Back at the shop by early afternoon, I set up like it was a proper project. Notebook, pencil, good light. The fan that had cooled this space since Reagan was president pushed warm air around. Same as always. Remember what I said about some things being written in memory instead of ink? Well, I was betting Dad's safe combination was one of them. I started with the obvious. Dad's birthday. Nothing. Mom's birthday. Nothing. The year the business started. Still nothing. Each attempt, I documented in my notebook with a neat line through it. Dad always said good records prevent repeated mistakes. All right, old man, I muttered, wiping sweat off my forehead. What, numbers meant enough to trust? That's when I remembered the Morrison contract, our first big break. 4 digits that changed everything. 4, 8, 3, 7. The purchase order number that put Mercer Steel on the map. I could still see Dad's hands trembling when he showed me that paper. I spun the dial carefully. 4, pause, 8, pause, 3, pause, 7. Nothing but the same mechanical resistance. The fan kept humming, indifferent to my frustration. You ever notice how time moves differently when you're chasing something just out of reach? The afternoons slipped away while I tried variations. Founding date plus Mom's birth month, last 4 of Dad's social, even the address of his first apartment. Each attempt went into the notebook. Each failure made the next try harder to believe in. Sunlight started painting orange stripes across the concrete floor. I sat back on my heels, hands grimy from the dial. Maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe grief was making me see patterns that weren't there. Hear meanings in casual phrases that Dad never intended. But I couldn't shake the feeling. You don't spend 30 years watching a man's habits without learning his language. Dad was deliberate, precise. If he'd mentioned treasures beyond ink while the vultures were circling, he meant something by it. Speaking of vultures, I grabbed a shop rag and wiped my hands. The safe would have to wait. No way I was leaving it unguarded overnight, not with certain relatives probably already planning their own exploration. The thought of them pawing through Dad's private space made my jaw clench. I did a proper lockdown. Checked the windows. Tested the door locks. Adjusted the motion sensor light to catch anyone sneaking around. The security system might be basic, but it was reliable, just like everything else Dad chose. Standing in the doorway, I took one last look at the safe. It sat there like a black steel puzzle box, keeping its secrets close. Tomorrow was another day, and I had plenty more combinations to try. Dad's voice echoed in my head. Patience beats force every time, son. I locked up and headed for the house. The evening air had that end-of-summer feel, warm but with a hint of change coming. Through my kitchen window, I could see the shop standing dark and solid, the motion light ready to catch any uninvited guests. The next morning started with a thud, literally. A FedEx envelope hitting my front porch like a bomb about to go off. You know that feeling when you just know something's wrong? Yeah, it was one of those moments. I poured my coffee, same as any other day, trying to keep to normal routines. But that envelope sat there on my kitchen table, like an unwanted guest, practically sneering at me. When I finally opened it, papers cascaded out like autumn leaves. Except these were all different shades of red. Past due notices, capital calls, vendor payment demands, each one carrying more zeros than I wanted to count. My hand shook as I sorted through them, making neat piles because, hell, organization was the only thing I could control right now. This can't be right, I muttered, but the numbers didn't change no matter how many times I blinked. You ever had one of those moments where the past comes back to bite you? Where something you did with the best intentions suddenly shows its teeth? I was staring at my signature on credit line guarantees I'd co-signed months ago. Back then, it seemed like basic business continuity, keeping things running smooth while Dad was sick. Now those same papers might as well have been death warrants for my financial future. The bank manager, Tom, picked up on the first ring. We'd known each other 20 years, played in the same golf league. Daniel, he said, and I could hear the grimace in his voice. I was hoping you'd call. Talk to me straight, Tom. How bad? Your cousins maxed out the business lines right after the funeral, and since you're a personal guarantor, I'm on the hook, I finished for him. My coffee had gone cold, forgotten, full liability, and they're already 30 days past due on the first payments. The room seemed to tilt sideways. I'd trusted them. Hell, I'd handed them the keys to the kingdom with those co-signatures, thinking I was protecting Dad's legacy. Now they were using that trust like a weapon, and I was bleeding out financially. I spent the next hour running numbers, each calculation worse than the last. Even if I liquidated everything I owned, it wouldn't cover half of what they'd borrowed. The word bankruptcy floated through my mind like a ghost, and my stomach clenched. Opening my email, I found old threads from just months ago. Messages where I'd approved credit increases, agreed to guarantee new equipment loans. Each one showed my faith in family, my belief in the business. Each one now read like a confession of pure stupidity. Your father would be proud of how you're handling things, one of my cousins had written. The date stamp showed it was sent the same week they were probably planning to gut the company. Remember that cold rain that soaks through to your bones? That's what shame feels like when it really sets in. I sat there at my kitchen table, watching the morning light crawl across those damning papers, feeling like the world's biggest fool. For a moment, just a moment, I nearly gave up. Let them win. Let them strip the company bare, sell off the equipment, close the doors Dad had opened 40 years ago. Maybe that would be easier than fighting what looked like a losing battle. I found myself walking to the shop without really meaning to. The familiar smell of metal and oil hit me as I opened the door. Scents that usually meant home and purpose, but now just reminded me of what I stood to lose. Dad's old measuring tape was still hanging where he'd left it, the brass case worn smooth from decades of use. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the spots where his grip had polished the metal. 25 feet of precision, he used to call it. Measure twice. Cut once. Wasn't just about steel for him. It was about life. Sitting on his work stool, I stared at the safe across the room. Was I just chasing fairy tales? Maybe there was nothing in there but old receipts and tax records. Maybe I was clinging to false hope because the reality was too hard to face. The measuring tape felt heavy in my hand. Dad had used this same tool to build everything we had, one precise cut at a time. Now here I sat, watching it all crumble because I'd trusted the wrong people. The phone rang around 4, just when the afternoon light was starting to get that tired look. It was Hank, Dad's oldest friend and our steel supplier going back 30 years. His voice had that careful tone people use when they know you're hurting but don't want to make it worse. "Danny," he said, and just hearing the nickname made my shoulders ease a bit. "Been thinking about you since the reading." "Yeah?" I rubbed my eyes, realizing I'd been staring at the same invoice for an hour. I could use some good thoughts right about now. Remember those Christmas Eves at the shop? Your dad always had us clear out early, but he'd stay behind for a few minutes. The memory hit me like a fresh cup of coffee. That's right, he'd do his lockup routine. And that safe of his. You ever notice how he'd hum that same tune while he was spinning the dial? Some old Willie Nelson song, I think. Then he'd tap the dial 3 times, like it was some kind of ritual. I sat up straighter. Wait, you think? I think your father was a creature of habit, Danny. Everything he did had a pattern. Those numbers might not be random. Could be tied to something meaningful. Holiday dates, maybe. Or when he landed that first big contract with Western Steel. Hell, could even be the day he opened the company doors. You know that feeling when someone switches on a light in a dark room? That's what Hank's words did to my brain. Can you come over? To the shop? Already grabbing my keys. 20 minutes. Later, Hank's truck pulled up outside. I watched through the shop window as he climbed out. Still tall, but moving slower these days, his hair more silver than black. When he walked in, he didn't head straight for the safe. Instead, he took his time, running his hand along the steel workbench like he was saying hello to an old friend. Your dad and I spent a lot of nights at this bench, he said quietly, planning jobs, solving problems. He always said the answers were right in front of us if we just looked hard enough. I moved to the safe, trying to see it through new eyes. I'd been thinking about combinations, birthdays, addresses, phone numbers, but maybe I've been going about it all wrong. Show me how he did it, Hank said, pulling up Dad's old shop stool. Walk through his routine, exactly as you remember it. I closed my eyes for a second, letting myself become that kid again, watching from the doorway while Dad closed up on Christmas Eve. The smell of metal shavings and machine oil helped take me back. He'd start by wiping his hands, I said, matching the memory with motion. Then he'd face the safe square on like this. My fingers found the dial. 12 to the left first. He always started at 12. Count it out, Hank suggested. Like he did. I nodded, turning slowly. 1, 2, 3. Steady, Hank murmured. Don't rush it. 8 to the right next. The dial moved smoothly under my fingers. Then 22 left. Hold on, Hank said suddenly. There was always a pause right there, remember? He'd stop for a second before the final turn. The memory crystallized. Dad's hand going still on the dial. That brief moment of silence before completing the sequence. How had I forgotten that detail? That pause was deliberate, Hank said. Part of the pattern. Just like the humming and the tapping. Your dad didn't do anything by accident, Danny. Not when it came to protecting what mattered. I took a deep breath and started over, feeling Hank's steady presence behind me. This time, I let muscle memory guide me instead of thought. 12 left, slow and deliberate. 8 right, smooth and certain. Then 22 left. But this time, I paused at 17, holding that beat of silence Dad always observed. The final turn felt different. There was a subtle resistance, then a click so soft I might have imagined it, if not for the way the hair stood up on my arms. Did you hear that? I whispered. Hank leaned forward. Try the handle. My palm was sweating as I gripped the steel lever. For a second, I thought nothing would happen, that we'd imagined the click, that this was just another dead end. Then the mechanism, released with a solid thunk that echoed through the quiet shop. Well, I'll be damned, Hank breathed. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges. Inside, stacked with Dad's characteristic precision, were 3 sealed manila envelopes, each stamped Addendum in red ink. Behind them sat a thick folder labeled Shareholder Agreement, executed, in Dad's neat block letters. My hands were shaking as I lifted out the first envelope. The notary seal caught the shop light. Crisp and official. Dated just 6 months ago. I carefully broke the seal and slid out the contents, spreading them on the workbench where so many contracts had been reviewed before. Hold on, I said, grabbing my phone. Need to document everything exactly as we found it. I took careful photos of each seal, signature, and date stamp. Hank stood witness as I captured every page. The language was clear as steel. Through instruments held separate from my last will and testament, I hereby transfer controlling interest. I had to stop reading for a moment, let the words sink in. What is it, Danny? He made me majority heir. Through share transfer, not inheritance. I flipped through the shareholder agreement. It's all here. Voting rights, board seats, everything. And look at this. He did it as a direct transfer of shares, completely separate from the will. Smart man, your father, Hank said softly. He knew they'd try something like this. The second and third envelopes contained duplicate copies, each marked to be produced if contested, in Dad's handwriting. My world, which had been spinning off its axis since the will reading, suddenly locked back into place with machine shop precision. I found a fireproof case in Dad's office and carefully stored the duplicates. The originals went into my briefcase. I'd take them to my own lawyer first thing tomorrow. Need to close up proper, I said, swinging the safe door shut. The lock engaged with a satisfying click. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. 3 voicemails and an email notification. Emergency board meeting. Dissolution vote scheduled. Hank's weathered hand squeezed my shoulder. What are you thinking? I ran my palm along the workbench, feeling the familiar scratches and dents from decades of honest labor. I'm thinking it's time to remind everyone what Dad always said about measuring twice and cutting once. You can probably guess they didn't know what hit them when I walked into that board meeting, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. I pulled up the board notice on my phone right there in the shop. Hank still at my shoulder. The subject line alone made my stomach clench. Notice of special meeting, dissolution, and asset liquidation vote. Take a look at this, I said, handing him the phone. The message laid it out in cold corporate language. 30 days to wrap up 40 years of business, convert machines to auction lots, and scatter Dad's legacy like steel shavings on the shop floor. Back in the office, I grabbed the wall calendar. The same kind Dad had used since I was tall enough to see the desk. With deliberate strokes, I marked the deadline in red. 30 boxes. 4 weeks to either save everything or watch it die. You know what's funny? I said to the empty room. All those years Dad spent teaching me to track every detail, document every step. Turns out that wasn't just about quality control. I pulled out a legal pad and started breaking it down the way he'd taught me. Objectives, timeline, resources needed. First priority was getting those documents authenticated. No point mounting a defense on paperwork that wouldn't hold up. Then schedule the shareholders' meeting, making sure to hit every notification requirement in the bylaws. Finally, prepare the exhibits, copies, certificates, everything labeled and indexed. The next morning, I walked into the lawyer's office carrying the originals in my briefcase. Not the same lawyer who'd read the will. I wasn't about to trust that fox to guard this henhouse. This was Sandra Chen, who'd handled contract reviews for us back when things were simpler. I need these authenticated, I said, laying out the documents. Every page, every seal, every signature. And I need it bulletproof. She examined each sheet with the focus of someone defusing a bomb. These are properly executed, she said finally. Notarized, witnessed, dated. The share transfer agreement is particularly well constructed. My shoulders started to relax. But then she added, "You understand this will get ugly." "Already is ugly," I replied. But I knew what she meant. The memory of that will reading hit me fresh. The smirks, the whispers, the pure humiliation of it. If these documents didn't hold up, the headlines would write themselves. Failed heir attempts, desperate power grab. I could almost hear the snickers, see the head shaking. For a moment, my hand moved toward the papers, ready to sweep them back into my briefcase and forget the whole thing. Then I remembered the way Hank had nodded when we opened that safe. Not surprised, just satisfied, like the universe was finally balancing its books. I thought about Dad's voice. "A man's word is his bond, son. But get it in writing anyway." I straightened my shoulders. "How soon can you have the authentication completed?" 3 days. I'll need to coordinate with the notary's office to verify their records. Good. Because I need to schedule an emergency shareholders meeting, and I want every I dotted before I do. Back at my desk, I started assembling the binders. One for each major document, with tabs for every significant clause and certification. The familiar work of organizing, labeling, cross-referencing. It kept my hands busy while my mind churned through scenarios. The calendar reminder popped up on my screen. Conference room A, 9 a.m. I stared at it, remembering the last time I'd sat in that room, watching my inheritance vanish clause by clause. Now I'd be walking back in there, this time holding the cards. My eyes drifted to the framed photo on my desk. Dad standing in front of the first automated press we'd installed, his hand resting on the control panel like he was introducing an old friend. He had that look he'd get sometimes. Proud, but not boastful. Like he knew exactly what he'd built, and didn't need anyone else's validation. I picked up the phone to book the room. 30 days wasn't much time to save a legacy. But Dad had built this company one precision cut at a time. The least I could do was defend it the same way. 29 days after that board notice landed on my desk, I stood outside conference room A with a leather portfolio under my arm. You know that calm, that settles in right before everything changes? That's what washed over me as I checked my watch. 8:55 a.m. The security guard nodded as he swiped his card, probably wondering why I wasn't already inside with the others. Through the glass, I could see them clustered around the table like kids at Christmas, passing dissolution packets back and forth, trading pens and practice signatures. Uncle Gerald's laugh carried through the door. That same smug chuckle I'd heard at the will reading. "Should we wait for Danny boy?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. Wouldn't want him to miss his own execution. I straightened my tie, more out of habit than necessity. Dad always said the steel business was about precision, about timing. You rush the cut, he'd tell me. You ruin the whole piece. At exactly 9 a.m. I walked in. Cousin Michael barely glanced up from his paperwork. Oh good, the witness has arrived. A few snickers rippled around the table. We've got your copy right here. Though really, it's just a courtesy at this point. I took my seat without a word, setting my portfolio on the table with deliberate care. The leather was worn smooth at the corners. Dad's old briefcase, the one he'd carried to every major contract signing for 30 years. Seemed fitting to bring it today. The lawyer, same one from the will reading, cleared his throat. Now that all parties are present, we can proceed with the dissolution. The motion has been properly noticed, and the voting shares are represented. He shuffled through his stack of documents. I'll need signatures from the majority shareholders on pages 3, 7, and 12. Uncle Gerald reached for his Mont Blanc, the one he'd started wearing right after the funeral. Let's get this done. I've got a golf game at 11. I watched them pass the papers down the line, each signature another nail in what they thought was my coffin. Cousin Michael even had the nerve to whisper something about finally getting rid of dead weight, while pointing the pen my direction. The packet reached the lawyer, who began his final review. Everything appears to be in order. Once I sign as witness, before you do, I said quietly, there are some additional documents that need to be entered into the minutes. I opened the portfolio and removed 2 sealed envelopes in a blue folder. Placing them carefully in the center of the table, the room got very still. What's this supposed to be? Uncle Gerald's voice had lost its humor. Mr. Lawyer, I said, keeping my tone professional, would you please authenticate these and read the relevant sections into the record? He picked up the first envelope with the wariness of someone handling unexploded ordnance. The seal cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then snap back to the top to read it again. He pulled out his loupe, standard procedure for document verification, and bent close to examine the notary's embossing. The metal magnifier caught the fluorescent light as he moved from signature to signature. Cousin Michael tried for bravado, more desperate. Tricks? We've been through this. These appear to be properly executed, the lawyer cut in, his voice slightly higher than usual. The notary stamps are authentic. Dates verified, witnesses. He swallowed. These are valid legal instruments. Uncle Gerald's fingers, which had been drumming an impatient beat on the table, went still. The sound of the air conditioning seemed suddenly very loud. I could have jumped in then. Could have started explaining. But Dad taught me something else about timing. Sometimes the most powerful moment is the pause right after the hammer falls. So I sat there, watching realization creep across their faces like rust on cheap steel. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, perhaps, the lawyer said into the stretching silence. I should read these into the record now. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and held the first document closer to the light. This addendum, dated 6 months prior to Robert Mercer's passing, is properly notarized by Ellen Matthews of Cook County. His voice gained strength as he continued. It specifically transfers majority ownership of Mercer Steel operations through an independent shareholder agreement, separate from and unaffected by the terms of the last will and testament. You know that moment when a casting crucible tips and molten metal starts to flow? That's what it felt like watching their faces. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, the executed shareholder agreement grants Daniel Mercer 51% controlling interest in all company assets, operations, and chairs scraped across the floor as Uncle Gerald shot to his feet. This is ridiculous. We need time to review, to verify. Call a recess, Cousin Michael demanded, already pulling out his phone. We need our own counsel to... Please, note in the minutes, I said calmly, that the documents have been authenticated in open session, and that the transfer of voting control is immediate upon verification. I turned to the lawyer. Isn't that correct? He nodded, still examining the papers. The language is quite clear. These instruments take effect upon presentation and authentication, which has now occurred. The conference room erupted into a circus of urgent phone calls. Watch them punch numbers, leave messages, send texts. But you can't unring a bell, and word travels fast in the steel business, especially word about attempted corporate raids that just backfired. No answer from Preston, Cousin Michael muttered, hanging up his third attempt. Thompson's in a meeting, Uncle Gerald growled, his face flushed. Since when does Jack Thompson not pick up for me? I kept my voice level. The board will remain seated until we draft and pass the necessary corrective resolutions. I placed another folder on the table, starting with the reversal of all unauthorized credit line advances made since my father's passing. Remember those summer afternoons when Dad would adjust the shop's ventilation system? The way heavy air would suddenly clear out, leaving everything lighter and cleaner? That's how it felt watching control shift back where it belonged, one signature at a time. The lawyer worked through each document methodically, comparing dates and numbers. These credit line authorizations appear to have exceeded standard operational limits by significant margins. The minutes should reflect, I said, that a full audit of fund allocations will be conducted. I reached for the last binder in my portfolio, the one with all those carefully tabbed ledger entries. Which brings us to the matter of misappropriated corporate assets. Uncle Gerald's Mont Blanc hit the table with a sharp crack. The sound echoed off the glass walls like a steel hammer finding its mark. I opened the binder to the first flag, columns of numbers marching down the page in Dad's precise hand. Some lessons you learn early. Document everything, trust patterns more than promises, and always, always, keep your tools sharp. For 20 years I'd maintained these books. Every entry, every transfer, every dollar that moved through Mercer Steel's accounts. Dad used to say the truth lives in the ledgers. Looking at those pages now, I couldn't help but think how right he'd been. The lawyer cleared his throat. Given the scope of these discrepancies, perhaps we should schedule a formal review session? Let's start with page 1, I said, settling back in my chair. The morning sun slanted through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beam. Somewhere in the building, a phone kept ringing, unanswered. The lawyer's pen scratched across page after page, formalizing what the documents had already set in motion. Each resolution hit like a steel press, stamping truth into permanent form. Resolution 1, he read. Pursuant to the authenticated shareholder agreement, all non-majority shares previously assigned through the last will and testament are hereby nullified and returned to company control. His voice carried the weight of law. Votes in favor? I raised my hand, my 51% making the outcome inevitable. The cousins' faces had gone from red to ash white. Resolution carries. The lawyer made a neat checkmark. Resolution 2. All unauthorized credit advances must be repaid within 30 days, with interest calculated at prime, plus 3%. Uncle Gerald's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass. You'd think a man who'd spent 40 years in steel would have a steadier grip. The records show, I said, opening another folder. 17 vendor credit accounts accessed without proper authorization. Total value, $812,000. I slid the summary sheet across the table. Plus, 6-figure personal reimbursements classified as operational expenses. Cousin Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then quickly turned it face down. But not before I caught Preston Manufacturing's name on the screen. Resolution 3, the lawyer continued, requires immediate notification to all business partners regarding the correction in corporate governance. He adjusted his glasses, along with confirmation of the forensic audit trail. I've prepared those notices, I said, removing a stack of envelopes. Each one contained copies of the shareholder agreement, audit summaries, and a personal letter assuring continuity of operations under proper management. The kind of documentation that lets partners sleep easy, knowing their interests are protected. The conference room phone lit up. The lawyer answered, listened briefly, then looked at me. Thompson Steel would like to confirm their next delivery schedule. They seem quite eager to speak with you directly. Nodded. Tell Jack I'll call him within the hour. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Uncle Gerald wince. Funny how fast 20 years of his golf games with Jack Thompson meant nothing once the truth came out. More phones buzzed. The cousins' devices lit up like Christmas trees, but not with good news. I caught fragments as they checked messages. Need to cancel our lunch meeting. Reviewing all pending contracts. Must postpone until situation clarifies. Remember dominoes? How Dad would set them up in the shop sometimes, showing me how one piece affects everything down the line? That's what their reputations looked like now, falling one connection at a time. The lawyer cleared his throat. For the record, these resolutions are now binding. Copies will be filed with the Secretary of State by close of business. He began gathering papers with methodical precision. I suggest all parties retain independent counsel regarding the repayment schedules and audit compliance. I stood, straightening my jacket. The motion sensor lights kicked on in the corridor outside, and that familiar office building hum seeped under the door. You know that sound. Ventilation systems, electronics, the steady pulse of commerce. I'd heard it every day for decades, but never quite like this. One last thing, I said, pausing at the door. Dad always said reputation is like a welding seam. Takes forever to build, seconds to break, and once it's compromised, the whole structure's at risk. I kept my voice neutral, professional. The audit documents have already been distributed to our top 20 partners. They'll draw their own conclusions about who they can trust. The hallway air hit my face like a clean morning breeze. Behind me, through the glass, I could see them still, sitting there, surrounded by the wreckage of their schemes. Their phones kept lighting up, each message another small death of opportunity and connection. Down the corridor, past the reception desk, a delivery man pushed a cart loaded with envelopes. Partners would be getting their notices within hours. By tomorrow, the whole industry would know who really controlled Mercer Steel, and how close it had come to being stripped for parts by its own family. I drove back to the shop just as the sun was dipping low enough to pour amber light across the concrete yard. You know that special kind of evening glow that makes everything look like it's been dipped in honey? That's what I came home to. The parking lot was empty, except for my truck. Everyone else had cleared out hours ago, probably spreading word of what went down at the shareholders' meeting. News travels fast in steel country, especially the kind that reshapes people's futures. I unlocked the side door, breathing in that familiar mix of metal shavings and machine oil that had been the backdrop to most of my life. Funny how some smells feel more like home than your own house does. First things first, I headed to the office to lock up the meeting minutes in the safe. Had to do everything by the book now, even more than usual. The papers made a soft whisper as I placed them inside, like they were telling their own quiet story of justice served. Time to get things back where they belong, I muttered, moving to the key rack by the door. One by one, I hung them in their proper spots. Shipping office, tool room, supply cage. Each key clicked into place like another piece of the company settling back into order. Walking through the shop floor, I ran my hand along the edge of a steel table. The surface was cool and smooth, worn down by decades of work and worry. Dad used to say you could read a shop's history in its tables. Every scratch a story, every dent a lesson learned. The workbench stood exactly where it always had, tucked against the west wall. Dad's hammer lay across it, right where he'd left it that last Friday. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight. The wooden handle was clean but darkened by years of palm prints, the head showing honest wear from thousands of strikes. Perfect balance, though. Dad wouldn't have it any other way. I set it across both palms, like I was making an offering. In a way, I guess I was. A promise to the man who'd built all this, who'd trusted me to keep it whole, even when he couldn't tell me directly. The cousin's downfall was complete. You couldn't have scripted it better if you tried. Legally, they were finished. The shareholder agreement stripped them of every share they'd tried to grab. The audit meant they'd have to pay back every penny they'd borrowed when they thought nobody was watching. But that was just the start. Remember what I said about reputation in steel country? By now, word would be spreading through every office and shop floor in 3 counties. Phones would be ringing, emails flying. The cousins' calendars, the ones they'd kept so full of golf dates and business lunches, would be emptying out faster than a punctured radiator. You can recover from losing money. You can bounce back from a bad deal. But trying to strip your own family's company for parts? That's the kind of stain that doesn't wash out. Every connection they'd built, every partnership they'd cultivated, all of it was turning to ash. In our business, trust is everything. Once it's gone, it takes the rest of your world with it. The last sunlight caught the hammer's head, throwing shadows across the workbench. I could almost hear Dad's voice, quiet and certain like it always was when he was teaching something important. A man's honor outlasts any fortune. That's what it had always been about. Not the money, not the power, not even the company itself. It was about doing right by the name he'd built, by the people who depended on us, by the principles that made all the rest of it mean something. I set the hammer back down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the bench's edge, just like Dad always did. Its shadow stretched long across the scarred wood, like a line drawn between past and future, between right and wrong, between what we build and what we leave behind.